Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We're the team from Yong-Gil University's Global Economics Department. On the slide, these are our team members along with the thesis director, Professor Young-Han Kim. Our topic is Global Partnership for Development, and we propose our vision for international trade, which is part of the Goal 8, by focusing on SouthSouth Trade and Aid for Trade. In our presentation, we'll first briefly evaluate the 8 Millennium Development Goals, and then we'll go deeper into the definition of trade. And we'll propose our key concept, SouthSouth Trade, and we'll explain the benefits of SouthSouth Trade and address some of its shortcomings. And finally, we'll discuss how to relieve those shortcomings by Aid for Trade. Now, we'll begin with some brief evaluations of MDGs. For Goal 1, the graph shows that the overall decreases in percentage continued over the past 2 decades. Even though the supposed objectives have not been met and 1 in 8 people are still living in hunger, it would be safe to say that MDG 1 will be achieved in the near future if this downward trend continues. For Goal 2, the statistics positively indicate that school enrollment in each region has been increasing. However, despite improvement, we still fall short of the initial goal of ensuring that boys and girls alike complete a full course of primary schooling. Still, 61% of the youth who lack basic reading and writing skills are young girls. For more balanced development, it is clear that more attention should go to young females. For Goal 3, empowerment of women has mainly been measured by the proportion of seats held by women in national parliaments. According to such criteria, there's been a clear and significant improvement. However, an important question remains whether the number of women in national parliament is a true indication of women's empowerment. For Goal 4, at first it may seem that UN activities to reduce child mortality have been successful across throughout the most regions in the world. As a result, the rates of child death have almost been halved between 1990 and 2011. But more progress is needed to meet the 2015 target, which is a 2/3 reduction in child mortality. For Goal 5, more progress is required in improving maternal health as well. There have been some improvements, but we still need more progress to meet the 2015 target. Roughly 85% of maternal deaths are coming from sub-Saharan Africa and Southern Asia combined, suggesting that more efforts should be concentrated on these regions. For Goal 6, there's been a clear decrease in the prevalence of HIV. The graph shows that the goal had a real impact on decreasing the spread of the diseases. But we should continue to invest in researching therapies and expanding knowledge on these diseases to prevent their spread. For Goal 7, despite our endless efforts to make the environment sustainable, the global emissions of carbon dioxide have been increased by more than 46%. We need to take bolder actions to prevent those threatening factors that destroy the environment. Especially cooperation across the whole globe is desperately needed, especially developing some protocols and taking decisive steps as soon as possible. Now, we would like to focus on Goal 8, Global Partnership for Development. It is divided into 4 specific targets indeed. Goal 8 is the most critical goal in that it can provide a certain theme or direction to make the developing world better off in terms of capital accumulation and economic growth in order to build their own infrastructure to support and encourage the other goals as well. However, we have noticed that these 4 targets largely depend on the economic and political conditions of the developed world. Therefore, we need a new additional target or a new metric for global partnership, which measures the self-sufficiency of the developing world. Our team our team seeks to have developing world be the real subject or center of development through SouthSouth Trade system. Now it is time to measure it by what the developing world can do now by themselves. Our next speakers will discuss the basic concept of trade and then further develop the concept of SouthSouth Trade.
International trade has been touted as a useful tool to create higher economic welfare by many scholars. According to Adam Smith, the so-called father of modern economics, trade benefits every participant by specialization. By virtue of specialization, each individual needs only to produce the good that is best at making a later trade with others. Through specialization and trade, everyone can enjoy more material benefits. The driving force of specialization is comparative advantage, which is defined as the ability to produce a good at lower opportunity cost. International trade reinforces this advantage of specialization by expanding the market size. Unfortunately, however, not all countries benefit equally from this international trade. International dependency theorists have argued that developing countries are being exploited for raw materials at low prices, while they provide good markets for value-added products from developed countries and only receive few obsolete technologies in return. This argument is known as core periphery theorem. Now, Ripczynski and Bhagwati provide theoretical explanation for this immeasurizing growth, which implies that a country achieves economic growth only to make their people worse off in every step they progress. As you can see here, their production capability has increased. However, the amount of utility enjoyed by each individual has actually decreased. The reason is that the developing countries are usually specializing in and exporting primary goods whose price may fall as they grow. As the terms of trade deteriorates, their income per capita may fall. In contrast, at the same time, developed countries benefit since the cost of production decreases as the price of raw material becomes cheaper and cheaper. As a result, the gap between developed and developing countries now gain inherent tendency to increase. Such exploitative relationship is called the North-South Trade. In general, developing countries are classified as South due to their geographic locations, and the term North is used to indicate the developed countries for the same reason. So, as an alternative, SouthSouth trade has been suggested and already practiced. The logic behind this trade lies with the fact that countries in the South are geographically close and share similar resource endowments, which leads to overlapping specialization. Countries in the South therefore trade not because of comparative advantage, but in order to realize economies of scale. Indeed, it offers many advantages that North-South trade does not. To begin with, developing countries can be less vulnerable to economic fluctuations stemming from developed West and to decisions made by those nations. The table that you see here now represents the annual growth of trade. The left column shows the annual growth of South-South trade, and the right column shows the annual growth of world trade, including North. As you may know, due to financial crisis in 2008, the world economy was in severe recession. Consequently, the amount of world trade has shrunk by 22%, whereas South-South trade has decreased by only 16%. How about after the crisis? It recovered and grew more quickly than the world trade did. In other words, countries in the South were less affected by the economic crisis and therefore more resilient than their developed neighbors in the North. And here lies the crux of our argument. We believe that this justifies nurturing South-South trade. Secondly, it is known to promote the emergence of small and medium-sized enterprises. Since their role usually lies in manufacturing, which is necessary for economic development, their role is pivotal for building self-sustainable economies. And lastly, South countries can provide places for testing its exporting capability. In order to trade with North countries, a company is required to meet a number of standards. For example, a country needs to ratify 27 international conventions to trade with EU. On the contrary, their neighbors can provide, in other words, their neighbors can be an easier target to launch their export since they do not require as much quality control, large volume, and corporate social responsibility. And the next speaker will continue.
Even with such positive aspects, SouthSouth Trade still has some limitations. Among them is the first, extraction of raw materials, second, lack of infrastructure, third, exorbitant tariffs, and finally, fourth, lack of human resources. The biggest problem of SouthSouth Trade is that it is imitating NorthSouth Trade's extraction of raw materials, mainly due to the different level of development amongst the South region. This led to higher raw material dependency of African nations, with fuel making up to 50% of total export to other South regions. Another major challenge is lack of infrastructure, especially in sub-Saharan region. Since there's no roads, ports, telecommunications, and electric networks, and all other basic necessities are often absent, it is nearly impossible to start trading in the first place. Also, exorbitant tariff also poses a hurdle for SouthSouth Trade. SouthSouth's merchandise exports often face tariff 3 times higher than that of the NorthSouth Trade. And finally, least developed countries, especially small island developing states, tend to face a fundamental challenge with their limited human capacity. Due to their small population, small island developing states often struggle to delegate experts in the negations they will define the terms of trade that they will face. This is growing more problematic due to the numerous number of trade agreements in the South. Now, what can be the solution to these problems? We suggest aid for trade as a solution. Aid for trade, a specific type of aid that aims to help the developing nations to promote trade, is categorized into 3 large types by OECD. The first is economic infrastructure, and second, building productive capacity, and finally, third is trade policy regulation. Each of them takes up 60%, 37%, and 3% respectively out of total aid for trade. According to a 2011 paper published by World Development, aid to infrastructure has an overall positive and significant impact on export, and 10% increase on aid to infrastructure showed 2.34% increase of ratio of export to GDP. Also, since the regionalization is one of the biggest problems, the fact that the manufacturer export to intra-regional trade in both Africa and Latin America should be considered, so that aid for trade can help in focused on enabling this intra-regional trade so that manufacture can grow. In addition, trade-related policy regulations and education should receive more than the current level of 3% out of total aid for trade. With the assistance, least developed countries will be able to cut their tariffs, and 10% cut on tariffs showed 1.6% increase on export, and this means $5.7 billion US profit for SouthSouth Trade each year. We have examined international trade, SouthSouth Trade in particular, and looked into the limitations and suggested aid for trade as the solution. SouthSouth Trade exhibits many advantages. First is that it makes developing nations more resilient to worldwide recessions. And second, it provides a favorable environment for small and medium-sized enterprises. And finally, exporters can join SouthSouth Trade more easily. However, we notice several pitfalls of SouthSouth Trade as well. The first is regional specialization by each continent of the South. Second, lack of infrastructure. Third, exorbitant tariffs that cause loss of welfare. And finally, lack of human capital faced by least developed countries and especially small island developing states. In response to these issues, aid for trade was suggested as a solution. Among the 3 categories of aid for trade, economic infrastructure and trade policy regulation should receive more attention than they're getting today. A2 infrastructure will promote intracontinental trade of Africa and Latin America, and trade policy regulation will be able to cut the tariffs, which will result in billions of welfare gains. All goals that comprise MDGs have their own meanings and importance. However, it is also important to realize that there might be one goal that can help other goals into progress. While not all problems they were aiming to solve stem from economic deprivation, but economic prosperity can help to improve other goals significantly. SouthSouth Trade may not be the panacea to all the problems of MDGs. However, it can certainly set the groundwork for a long-term solution. So far, we discussed the global partnership and how it should proceed to promote the economic welfare of developing countries of South. When we use the term global partnership, we do not refer to an unequal partnership where developed nations has all the decisions. However, more of a cooperation among developed and developing countries so that they can reverse the existing historical trends and devise an alternative way to build self-sufficient economies. Thank you for listening to our presentation.
Hi, Matthew from UNDP. Thank you very, very much for a logical and well-structured presentation. I mean, I work on some of the aspects of the Global Partnership for Post-2015 stuff and the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation that was obviously forged here in Korea 2 years ago. And it's a bit of a job to put it all into one box because there is so much to it. And obviously, South-South Trade is on the rise and as an important aspect to ensure prosperity and development for everyone. But it is a global partnership, not a South-South partnership. And there are, I think we need to look beyond. I mean, aid for trade is great. The WTO-led processes make sense, boosting infrastructural capacity to plug gaps to help people do business and trade. This is all good. But at the same time, thinking globally about the global partnership, basically ODA, Official Development Assistance, is entirely relevant for still a number of countries that remain, sadly, aid-dependent. So we need to factor this into our thinking when we're talking about the global partnership in future in a really, really big way. And there are commitments, this was 0.7% of, commitments for rich countries as well that need to be continued and focused on and needs to be fully incorporated into a future global partnership, in my opinion. We also need to look at things like, knowledge exchange and technology exchange as part of this capacity development stuff. For the future, and this can be north-south, south-south, or all three ways, triangular if you want to use our kind of jargon for it. So these are also key things that need to be looked at. So I think, it's a solid case for the importance of South-South, but I think we need to be a bit more visionary in our approach to the global partnership and to pull it under one roof, perhaps more comprehensively. That's just my... But, as I said, well-structured, well put together, well-researched, so thank you very, very much.
I also thank you for your presentation. It is a good attempt at deriving policy lessons from economic analysis. As a research economist, who worked for the African Development Bank for 3 years, I know some data about Africa. And looking at your graph on each region's manufacturing export to South, for Africa it was 45% it has increased to 45%. The trade among African countries is just 10%. The rest of it, mainly African trade with China. So to me, it sounds that you're talking about South-South cooperation seems to be cooperation with China of developing countries. So that's why I doubt whether South-South cooperation is long-term solution to economic development. In retrospect of Korean development from very poor country, as poor as Ghana, more poorer than Ghana in 1960. Now we are one of the OECD countries. Our experience tells us that familiarizing the economy and people with advanced way of doing business, that means more trade with advanced countries have larger technological spillovers and other benefits. So there are countering arguments. So we need to look at both arguments and then make judgment. This my main comments. And another comment is the evidence that you have to support the advantages of South-South trade is looking at the growth rate of trade, South-South trade and world trade, and comparing them. South-South trade is higher and more stable. In the wake of the global financial crisis in 2009, it decreased much less than the world average. That reflects not the goodness of the South-South trade, maybe, but another factor is underdevelopment of banking. You know, the global crisis was banking crisis, and the banks in the South was less developed. So that's why they get a less negative impact from the global crisis. So, and reflecting on this, underdevelopment of banks reflects the low social capital or social capabilities to do business, lower trust in the country. Things like this hampers development of institutional infrastructure. More important to determination of the cost of transactions comes from institutional underdevelopment. So trade between South-South involves very high transaction cost because of the underdeveloped institutions. So these points can help you to improve your further thinking about this issue. Thank you.
Thank you. You have chosen MDG 8, which is actually very relevant. It's the least talked about MDG, and it's the only MDG of the 8 that has reference to other than developing and poor countries and involves reference to the role of development assistance, ODA, and the rich and developed countries. So congratulations on that choice. The first part of the presentation, you had very limited time to actually present your research, and going through the achievement of the MDGs, I think that took a bit of your focus from the MDG 8. There was no need to go into those details because you could have used that more time to relate to what you have wanted to focus on in terms of the MDG 8. In terms of the investment and economic development, I was surprised there was no reference at all to private sector. I mean, a lot of the direct investment is done by the private sector. ODA is from governments, official development assistance, and there's, whether it's bilateral or multilateral, but the role of the private sector and maybe in terms of trade, trade barriers and tariffs and subsidies. Subsidies, for example, the largest subsidized farmers in history are in economies in Europe, and the fact that there are so many subsidies, there's a lot of cheap agricultural produce that very difficult for African farmers or any other farmers to compete with. So that the role of that and that reference was sort of missing in your presentation. On the whole, I think you've made a very good presentation. You went too far in the focus on South-South, but I think you needed to focus on something, and you chose something that is, in the future, I think is going to be very, very important. Thank you very much. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. And please give a big hand to all the presenters and judges. Now we are closing session 1 and 2, and now we are going to have a lunch between 1:15 to 2:50. The lunch will be served in your seats. We prepared a lunch box. And also I have an important announcement to make. Since we have to be secured this room in order to wait for His Excellency, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, the United Nations, Secretary General of the United Nations. So you have to finish your lunch until 2 o'clock, and you have to get out of this room with all your belongings, and then the security team will be here to have a security check. And then you have to also have some personal security check beginning at 2:30 in front of this grand volume. You have to pass metal detector. Sorry for this inconvenience, and enjoy your lunch. Bon appetit.